Welcome to the Green Ring, and thanks for watching this note-by-note dissection of Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen. This video is 10th in a series of 16 devoted to Die Walküre Act 1. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly literature, it's a massive journey I hope you'll take with me, one I'm dedicated to finishing. For an explanation of who I am and more on the reasons for this series, please check the preface video, first in a group of 6 building a foundation to this in-depth analysis. Before diving into this video, you may want to watch the case for Erda, the case against Wotan, and the case for Loge, which present my views on how and why Wagner manipulates his musical syntax as he does, in the process identifying key morphemes which I believe define the entire work. You'll find explanations for why the terms leitmotif, motif, and motive have been replaced by morpheme, module, and cell in the chapter titled Music as Text. Links are provided in the comments below. My aim is to mount subsequent videos each week with breaks of approximately a month between each drama's acts until the entire ring is analyzed. We pick up where we left off in the midst of Siegmund's desperate need for a weapon, page 63 in Dover's Full Score, second stave. Horns answered the Welsung's last note with another menacing kniding pulse, trombone chord sustaining, the threat of his racial enemies hidden in darkness, smothering his hope. The orchestra falls silent a full minute, Siegmund resuming a semibreve after the last horn crotchet to meditate a cappella on his vulnerability. His initial static ash interval, followed by a third descent and Welsung bounce, to rise a third into another horn throb with trombone chord. A crotchet after they fall silent, his next a cappella phrase lifts a low ash interval, elided to a reverse, both on thirds, its crib on his father's third bounce, suggesting his hope for a weapon, a phrase he caps with a static ash interval and tritone plunge, triggering yet another kniding module, finished by one of the Meister's supple transitions. First cello solo eases from the ominous kniding syntax, fading through its last static ash interval, joined on the next downbeat by 8 cellos arranged in 4 chairs of 2 players each to make the next 6 measures a numinous evocation of the equivalent effect when Welsung Love first sounds. This also eases the mode imperceptibly into the gentlest of major 7th harmonies, the solo's first module a delicate grace turn, with its breath of the prelude's giant turn to initiate his brief contemplation of the woman who keeps him in this place. He begins with a sweet falling 3-note 6/4 arpeggio, its inverted heroic melody notes a seemingly passing touch to acquire a life of its own in the coming love music. As cellos descend slowly in the reverse melody notes of his sexual potential, he echoes it with his own giant turn, slightly truncated to stress its own reverse melody notes. Solo cello answers with a pulse of the sexually charged chromatic love module, which he echoes, overlapping solo cello's next love pulse to double its last 3 notes, harmony tightening. First violins take a third iteration as the text intensifies, second violins violas relegating the cello choir to its bass alone, his brief moment of calm evaporating. The threatening octavo horn pair's kniding throb steals in ever more powerfully, its first pulse without double impact, the next complete after a minim rest, followed by a third after another minim rest. Thus impelled, Siegmund's fascination for his twin moves through a pair of echoing phrases, each lifting from static notes into rare high ash intervals, the first a minor 6th, the second a major, both plunging from them on that same interval. This seemingly passing touch expands an embryonic module which, in Rheingold, characterizes Loge and Wotan as they tussle with Albrecht over the rightful heir to nature's power, a cell to declare its full meaning only in Götterdämmerung. Strings buoy him with predominantly minim chords, the cellos with special interest, etching first an incomplete, then a perfect God turn. The second harmonized in thirds by first violins as they support his last phrase's ash interval bounce. On the next downbeat, harmony expanding in a drive toward climax, first violins initiate a septuplet pulse, second violins violas joining on the next downbeat to evoke the storm which led him to this spot. The horn ostinato telescopes from a last strophe of the complete Hunding rhythm through a pair of 3-note static interval pulses, followed by 2 static intervals, as cellos rise on melody notes, then fall, doubled octavo by contrabasses, on their reversals. Another subtle God turn, Wotan's racial opposition to the giants, further buttressing the storm memory. Writing this foment, the Welsung's passion morphs into outrage over Sieglinde's bondage under the Nibelung, as he lifts on reverse chord notes into a reverse ash interval on a third, to pass through more static notes finished by an air to fourth lift, an ironic ringlust distortion, as he moves one step closer to realizing Wotan's desire. After a crotchet rest, his echoing phrase begins a fourth below to rise the same interval, a reverberation of the Welsung race, then ascends through reverse chord notes, sinks a third, and finishes on the air to fourth of a low ash interval, its guarded hope compromised by etching another ringlust crib. With his last note, the horn ostinato rumbles its final Nibelung pulse, shorn of a static interval, to join all horns, bassoons, and ongoing septuplet string pulses on the next downbeat in an anticipatory semi-breve chord swell, its climax one of the epic's more dramatic syntactic evolutions. The Welsung's desperate appeal to his mysterious father, possibly the tenor role's vocal high point, never mind one of the most hair-raising in all opera, is also a syntactic landmark to rank with any in the tetralogy. He twice calls to Welse on falling octaves, the top note of each held as long as the singer can manage. Until now, a veiled marker of nature's power turned to anti-natural purposes, here the falling octave at last becomes a morpheme audiences grasp definitively, whose clearest prior echoes sound in curse, sword, and insidiously in Erda's Rheingold warning. Attaching itself to the armament meant to bring Wotan the ring is among the epic's most pointed ironies, one certainly intended by Wagner. Even if some may resist this claim, the remaining syntactic elements in Siegmund's cry for help answer such qualms. The Welsung hurries from this remarkable moment, calling for the sword to an anti-barrier, the next mark in his role as the god savior, then continues on another echo of Wotan's inspiration, Cook's purpose of the sword, with its rising-falling third cell and suggestion both of lust for the ring and the curse. On its heels, he repeats the portentous ringlust module to conclude with yet another falling octave. Octavo-low strings underline this segment with graces falling into timpani rolls, each strophe inaugurating air chords, the first of each in horns bassoons, the second answered as they lapse on quavers by tremolo violin viola minims. This combined effect, striking in itself, also sketches a pair of chord note oppositions, necessarily including the opposition's reversal, another whiff of Tarnhelm and Dragon. The Welsung rises towards another climax, roughly doubled by octavo cello viola tremolos, clarifying his vocal outline of a distorted retrograde ring fragment, evoking that module's most recent echoes in the Nibelung threat. Siegmund parses this sinister morpheme as a low ash interval through Wotan's bouncing thirds, and 2 consecutive ringlust strophes, to finish at the passage's intense height by leaping up another low ash interval on an air to fourth, capped by a last plunging octave, supported in a bassoon horn air to chord pulse, and rounded with the final rising air to fourth. Wotan may have plans for the Welsung, but the Earth Mother has as well. At this high point, stage directions state, Das Feuer bricht zusammen. Es fällt aus dem aufspruchenden Glut plötzlich ein greller Schein auf die Stelle des Eschenstammes, welcher Sieglindes Blick besichnet hatte und an der man jetzt deutlich ein Schwertgriff haften sich. The mood instantly shifts from dark threat to the ethereal glory of C major associated with Wotan's hopes, which dominates the following episode. A burst of fingered violin tremolos across 4 desks with high woodwind breve, semi-breve crotchet chord supports first trumpet's bold sword iteration. Despite its beauty, the passage calls Wagner's dramatic judgment into question, as its initial thrill eases into the broad lyricism of Walküre's first aria, one voice undisturbed by others. Ever since Hunding's response to the narrative, words and music have relentlessly labored to paint the Welsung's weaponless plight, his anguished cries reaching a frantic peak, only for the desperately needed weapon to appear before his, and as importantly, an audience's eyes. Rather than seizing it, however, he rhapsodizes his lady-love. The Meister's text implies Siegmund, dazzled by the flash, can't make out its source, but this never plays well, and no production available on video finds any way to improve on it. Krebiel must physically restrain his doubting chum, who'd otherwise leap up shouting, "Ain't you even gonna take a peek at the damn thing?" Even so, the sonic wonders distract audiences just as Sieglinde's memory diverts the young hero, empathetic love's first decisive thrust against a brutal world. Close cousin to Loge's Rheingold panegyric, Siegmund's aria explores the epic's core subtext, unnatural versus natural power. The Rheingold episode features nature as it is, while the present idyll paints it as Wotan would have it. Benignly transcended on the surface, its core symbol is a weapon designed to seize back another great repository of nature's power turned against itself, wiping out an entire ancient race in the process. Fatally stabbed by the sword, Fafner calls himself den letzten Riesen. Siegmund's lyric also dwells fondly on a murkier, incestuous subtext, though the Meister disguises it in tender hints which first-time audiences are unlikely to decode consciously. This initial sword iteration and woodwind chord support ends after 4 measures, leaving 8 additional strophes woven in connective syntax across the episode's remainder. The violin tremolo's next 4 measures float Siegmund's first reaction, begun on an up-down beat double impact, to lift through a tonic arpeggio parsed across 3 whirl-dash intervals, a high on a third, a static, then a swifter high interval on an air to fourth, to emphasize his acute plunge into nature, ironically triggered by a weapon designed to fatally pierce it. The Welsung's next phrase, after a crotchet rest, rises a third into, of all things, a barrier, albeit its conclusion mitigated by dropping a placid sixth into extended melody notes, capped with an answering 6th plunge, followed by a 3rd lift, ringlust, in distorted retrograde. Neither phrase disturbing C's tonic 1 harmony. Ended by a chagrin strophe, this phrase marks Loge's Rheingold manipulation, which first trumpet answers with a gentler sword pulse, reinforced by another high woodwind chord, first horn added, violin tremolo shifting to C6. The morpheme's heroic melody notes dispel this brief yet poignant minor cloud, Erda shading the face of Wotan's glory, as woodwind's violin tremolos shift to the C1 tonic, first horn intoning unmistakable chord notes. Woodwind's last crotchet fades on the next downbeat as lingering first horn descends a soft third to lift and fall on that interval, then rise a 5th from its low minim. This subtle third bounce and ringlust pulse, echoing both Wotan and through him Siegmund. Its high F-sharp triggering a 2-measure shift into E major, forte piano violin tremolo emphasizing the shock. The Welsung's initial double impact, as he descants first horn, rises a third through a low ash interval to sink across that heroic melody note retrograde from his Sieglinde meditation, then extend it into an anti-barrier, whose last note sparks the E major thrill on the word Blitz. Tremolos outline a classic 1-5-1 cadence, floating Sigmund's next phrase, a sixth descent into a third rise, a hopeful ringlust retrograde, then a reverse chord note opposition, capped by Erde fourth ascent, first horn's ominous fifth plunge clouding its sunny optimism. On the measure's next and last beat, tremolos shift to E minor, its C3 chord returning to the original key as first trumpet initiates a third, still gentler sword pulse over the breve crotchet chord which first horn has ceded to the other three. Fingered violin tremolo switch to flagged, two measures preparing Sigmund's attention shifting from the sword to contemplating Sieglinde, or at least his idea of her. Following the sword, a distinctive module introduces a syntactic palimpsest for his change of focus. First oboe, first clarinet, first horn counterpoint supplements the continued violin tremolo, as first flute traces the sword through all its modules, fourth lift, falling octave, abandonment triad, and heroic melody notes. In blurring the rising tonic arpeggio's rhythmic motion, finished by reversed melody notes, with violin tremolo doubling, the bundle effortlessly morphs into a version of Sieglinde's morpheme, as the harmony shifts to C5, then the poignant minor of 6. This brief Lohengrin-like shadow recurs 5 times in the aria's later portion, after the hero's attention focuses exclusively on Sieglinde. Mute during this evolution, the Welsung resumes with its last measures upbeat on static notes leading into the downbeat's C4 harmonic shift, through which he lifts a pair of low ash intervals, their thirds adding up to an abandonment triad. With this subtle reminder of potential culpability against his unknown sister, he marvels at the sword's glow, lighting a fire within him, a phrase he concludes by sinking on a sixth as the harmony makes its most dramatic shift to date, sustained in flute clarinet semibreves, E-flat major chromatically slipping to D major as he finishes his line on a heroic rising fifth. D major 1 being 5 of G major, the next measure slides into that key as first oboe takes a gentle sword pulse, its top pitch lingering on a dotted minim to descend in an echoing tonic crotchet arpeggio through the next measure. The young hero's subsequent phrase begins with first oboe's top B, his breve rest giving the sword full voice, his trio of static intervals moving into heroic melody notes, capped by a bona fide anti-barrier, meaning with its wonted final rising fifth, as he refers to Hunding's wife as der blühenden Frau. On the next measure's downbeat, his phrase's last pitch initiates the aria's most varied harmonic texture. Rather than slipping far too obviously back into C, G's dominant, it first passes through D, only lingering in C for half a measure. From there, the Meister characterizes this decisive moment, Sigmund's love clearly emerging with its link to the sword, by a rapid, harmonic progress finding its way back to C after 7 busy measures. Only a quaver rest separates the Welsung's previous phrase from his next, as he ties his emotions to the woman's gaze when she left the room. Lifting on melody notes, a barrier on a falling fourth sketches his ambivalence, concluded by a chord note opposition with descending third cap. Woodwind chords, violin tremolo, complicate his syntax, violin oboe taking a more leisurely barrier to parallax that in the Welsung's phrase, while amid them second clarinet intones chagrin with the reverse chord note cap. This sweet tangle, hinting both at Siegmund's frustrated longing and the future problems love will pose Wotan, stills into a third clarinet's giant turn on minims through the next two measures, E minor followed by a rapid shift from A7 to G major then D, mark of Siegmund wrestling his emotions. Giving this harmonic wealth voice, the Welsung moves through static notes until doubling third clarinet's giant turn by lifting on melody notes into the next measure's B major, which shifts to a pathetic E minor, B's subdominant, as first oboe sighs the next sword iteration, wistfully mirroring his lyric here by echoing itself several minutes before as the young hero watches Sieglinde leave the room. First trumpet dispels this brief cloud with the next measure's glorious harmonic return to C major, Wotan's optimism in a sixth pulse of the sword. Violins exchanging tremolos for a syncopated pulse continued across the next 23 measures. Violas reinforce the first two, sustained by horn, woodwind, breve, crotchet, pedal, as harp sine waves blossom. The first, a broad full measure natural arc, then two progressively sinking ones in the second to match the horned woodwind's pedal fade. Up to this moment, the aria's orchestral texture, Siegmund's vocals built almost entirely from diatonic intervals, recreates the Rheingold prelude's elemental ambience, disturbed by insidious sword pulses with their dire falling octaves, abandonment triads, and syntax-forming heroic melody notes, to suggest not Erda's world, but Wotan's hope for Welsung's and sword to recreate it for him in his own image. The subtle ambiguity expands with the first measure after the sword falls silent, harp arpeggios rising in modules evoking Rheingold scene 1 waves. As with his next phrase, Siegmund begins an extended metaphor, this unknown woman likened to the sun, her departing glance lifting him out of his personal darkness. Fortifying the irony, stage directions call for the hearth fire to progressively dim from this moment forward, a routinely ignored touch, many productions dispensing with the fireplace altogether. This compact episode's harmonic evolution moves slowly from dark minor into warming major, third horn minims descanting Siegmund's vocals as to the word nächtliches Dunkel. He climbs leisurely up melody notes to fall a third, a chagrin pulse, the phrase parsed as an inverted ash interval. From it, he sinks through a reverse interval on chord notes, capped by reverse chord notes, and after a crotchet rest, loosely doubled by first oboe as the harmony brightens, he joyfully ascends first on a third, then a fourth, through a low ash interval to make the phrase the first inversion crib of the heroic melody notes with their distorted sword echo. From it, first oboe's doubling more precise, he sinks through extended reverse melody notes to conclude the phrase by sinking a Welterb triad into the god turn of Wotan's Rheingold inspiration, which, were it not for the third added by his triad, exactly duplicates his father's, definitive birthplace of the barrier. These markers of Welsung racial fertility embody Warfather's hopes while reinforcing Erda's stake in wresting away that fecundity's end result for her own purposes. Even as he identifies the sword's glow with his object of adoration, Siegmund is as unaware of the threat that weapon poses as he is of the reasons it's so dangerous both to him and the woman he's idolizing. On his phrase's last note, first horn banishes more complex harmonies with the sword's seventh iteration, interlaced first in a measure-long rising-falling harp arpeggio, then, with the next measure, 4 tonic note ascending ones. This brief 4-measure interlude crests as violas slide up, then down their own natural sign, consisting of abandonment and Welterb triads. First oboe clarinets repeating the earlier Sieglinde variant to reinforce its association both with Siegmund's twin and now the sword. First horn doubles its arpeggio, while first harp plucks sextuplet up-down octaves in an eerie wisp of Albrecht's Rheingold entrance, a hint deepening the passage's ambiguity to bear fruit during the act's final moments. With the Sieglinde sword's last note, a half measure of minor harmony, first harp descends on a tonic arpeggio to extend this leisurely decrescendo as the Welsung glories in his newfound love, his first two phrases posing a riddle to be solved only as Walküre concludes. Like so much of the Meister's syntax, this sequence's deep implications must await their time to be fully assimilated. But a hint lies in the orchestra's duple time, set against Siegmund's brief shift into triple for these two phrases alone. While no repetitive morpheme, it does recur twice under uniquely revealing circumstances, if only during Walküre. He builds its echoing pair from reverse melody notes with their implications of Welsung fertility, two for each phrase as parenthesis around modules born of the Rhine maiden's vivacity migrated into Albrecht's wooing, which work their way into the Welsung sorrows and those of his entire breed. Combined with the young hero's lyric, comparing his twin to sunlight around his head, this module suggests heroism's noble hope, masking its tragic potential. Added to the syntax's ambivalence, its echo phrases both its reverse melody notes as reverse ash intervals. Upward striving harmonies combine with the vocal's ascent to give the whole a plangent urgency, rising harp arpeggios, two per measures, strung through it to suggest natural benediction's unreliable glow. The Welsung's final reverse melody notes launch a measure first harp fills with a natural sign, low brass reappearing on its third beat, a choir gone silent the moment this aria begins. Ottavo trombones growl a portentous static ash interval, the giant thump associated with both Hunding and Nibelungs, along with Siegmund's imperiled demigod circumstances through the Valhalla ash interval dogging him since the prelude. Its last note changes the harmony to a particularly dark minor, as trombones sink on a triadic arpeggio, which, though it isn't a ring fragment, has that morpheme's same threat. It foreshadows his immediately sequent phrase, imagining the sunlight's disappearance behind the mountains, a clear metaphor of Sieglinde banished to her knighting lord's bed. After his dotted minim rest, giving trombone static ash interval voice, the Welsung lifts a third into another reverse melody note pulse, phrased as the direst of inverted ash intervals. In reaction, the mode returns to major, a swift major-minor-major flux with its certain marks of Erda's shaping presence, here underlined by fourth trombone rising on melody notes to ironically announce the penultimate sword iteration. Returned to first trumpet, it lacks its initial Erda fourth, the only strophe out of 9 in this passage without it. A long rising harp arpeggio as preface, another to cap it, then, in the next measure, a broad rising falling arc, harmony shifting dramatically and reassuringly back to major. With this penultimate sword pulse, stage directions ask for a final hearth flicker, ignored for decades in productions, one of those offhand errors of omission which subtly weaken the episode's conceptual cement. Loge represents libido, and the Meister utilizes that primal association throughout this passage, while also reinforcing the link between Erda's nature and the Welsung's unfolding role as both her friend and foe. The young hero rests a full breve-dotted crotchet to allow for an effect which never comes, resuming as he likens his sister to sunset's reassuring afterglow. Violins violas trade pulsations for minim chording to wind down the passage's ardor as 4 consecutive sword Sieglinde variants float above them, the first on an oboe-clarinet horn ensemble, the second first clarinet first oboe bassoons, English horn taking the third while omitting its Erda fourth lift. the last on first clarinet without its falling octave as well, to make it a virtually pure Sieglinde iteration. Throughout, first harp alternates measures of paired rising triplet arpeggios with single measures of only one to finish on a last rising falling arc. The young hero's vocal, the sequence's focus, begins on the final measure of violin-viola pulsations, his Welsung bounce followed by his racial sexual vitality's reverse melody notes. Resting a crotchet, he lifts a hopeful low-ash interval on a fourth into that merry Rhine maiden bounce with its Welterb triad, completed by another rising Erde fourth. Resting a dotted semibreve, he initiates the aria's next phase set to a particularly revealing lyric. Selbst der alten Eschestamm glänzt in goldener Glut. The Meister rationalizing why his hero spends all this time apostrophizing Sieglinde when he would more logically pull out the sword on the spot. Siegmund lifts a second through another low-ash interval to sync on more reverse melody notes, a phrase he repeats after only a quaver rest, though trading the ash interval for chord notes, all mutedly hopeful modules, his reverse melody notes doubling English horn's two sword Sieglinde variants. His last note triggers the aria's final soft trumpet sword iteration, flagged violin-viola tremolos returned, arco contrabasses syncing chromatically with tremolo cellos, the morpheme's two nominal C major bars moving through a gentle harmonic kaleidoscope, the second with the final gently rising harp arpeggio in triplets. The aria's coda slips into dark harmonies and orchestral colors, an apt portrayal of the young hero's dejection over loss of his glowing love object. Strings outline two semibreve chords, followed by another pair harmonically lowered on trombones, a crotchet harp stroke tapping the third beat of each pair to fall silent until the act's genuine love music begins. With this somber chording, the Welsung rises a fourth, then after a crotchet rest falls a Welsung triad, to ascend another fourth after a quaver rest, then, with the last crotchet rest, sink a third on the word Verlicht. Viola's low strings intone a pair of harmonically syncing reverse Erde chords as Siegmund describes the murk enclosing him. The first of his echoing static note phrases capped in a Welsung bounce, the second replacing fourths with thirds, his racial hopes fading with the light through the lens of his father's hopes. In the next measure, eerily sinister octavo trombones lift from dotted semibreve into minim hyper-extended melody notes, a spear-opposing scale, as he breathes that a lichtlose Glut still illuminates his heart. An unnerving comment he finishes underpinned by bassoon's reverse melody notes with the reverse ash interval on an ominous descending fifth. With his concluding minim on the next downbeat, viola contrabass octavo pedal supports timpani, wrapping the softest of Hunding rhythms, that racial menace still looming over the Welsung, though here dying away across the next two measures through a quaver and double impact pulse, then two crotchet strokes. This extended aria blends Siegmund's growing love for Sieglinde with Wotan's Rheingold hopes, along with subtle hints of Erda's unseen manipulation, its syntactic kaleidoscope infused with the glow of optimism darkened by tragic irony. Love, which fared so badly in Rheingold, might or might not have a chance in this new environment, tainted by the very crimes which sparked all the trouble in the first place. Along with Siegmund's narrative and the pantomime of Hunding bullying Sieglinde into his bed, this aria encompasses the three worlds fighting for dominance: giant Nibelung mortals, Wotan's power bid through his Welsungs, and Erda's struggles to deal with both. Siegmund is all but completely under the god's seductive thrall, with its vision of nature in the immortal's image epitomized both by the sword and the Sieglinde sun metaphor. Yet Hunding's brooding shadow looms over it, and the Welsung must find a way through and finally beyond immortal and giant Nibelung worlds alike. His one hope is Erda's as yet murky vision for transcending these bitterly opposing factions, its brightest glimmer the twins' empathetic love, an ideal both luminously confident and fiercely endangered. That's it for now. My aim is to keep these videos close to a half hour instead of the longer ones, which sometimes make Das Rheingold a bit of an endurance test. The next video picks up where this one leaves off, Sieglinde coming to Siegmund after she's drugged Hunding. Page 73 in Dover's Full Score, Stave 2. As always, thanks for watching, and please do leave your comments below. Time and energy allowing, I'll do everything I can to respond. Lastly, as all YouTubers know, your subscription to this channel by itself is a huge assist in completing this vast project. Hit the bell to be notified of the next videos. With luck and your support, there's a lot more to come.